All right, let's get more details on this. I'm joined by political economist Siya Biniza to unpack the planned relief efforts. So, Siya, 500 billion rand, it's a lot of money, but is it enough?
Sure, I think that's the big question on everyone's mind. Look, I definitely think that it's a step in the right direction. The president has made a lot of the commitments that are necessary to deal with, particularly the lower or the poorest South Africans' livelihoods. And I think that's definitely positive. I do worry, though, that perhaps if you look at some of the extensions that have been made in terms of the COVID grant for non-child or non-pension grant recipients, that the 6-month envisaged may be too short a time period, and government might look towards expanding that as obviously the pandemic unfolds. But I think at this point it's quite early to say whether or not this is sufficient. Obviously the devil still remains in how government's going to implement this.
So let's talk about the businesses in particular first, and then we'll get to the individuals who will benefit from this. There's tax relief,
Sure.
There's funding also available for businesses. So how is that looking? And given the scale of how bad it's going to be for many businesses, is that enough? Because that will be the question we'll be asking constantly.
Sure. So I think the way they've done it in terms of government providing guarantees to the tune of total 200 billion rand is quite a responsible way to look at it from a fiscal perspective. Obviously, though, merely providing lending to companies is not sufficient, mainly given that their revenues have been cut at this point. Obviously, with the demand quite slow as a result of the lockdown, we're not expecting them to make any major sales, even as we start easing the lockdown over the phased period, which I suspect will probably be 12 to 18 months. And I do worry that in the next short-term period, let's say 9 to 12 months, that we might see a lot of those loans that have been extended, non-performing, etc., as a result of the economic environment not having improved substantially. My bigger concern is some of the report back that the president's speech gave to us in terms of the 3 billion that was set aside through the IDC and the Department of Trade and Industry, which has only seen a commitment of around 100 million rand. And given that this was made about 3 weeks or 2 weeks ago, it's quite concerning that the money is not necessarily finding itself to the businesses fast enough. This may be an issue of compliance. As I understand, there's a significant portion of small and medium enterprises that don't necessarily comply with the requirements, such as being registered with UIF and other compliance issues, but also it may be as a result of companies struggling to prove that they've been negatively affected by COVID. But either way, we need to deal with the bottleneck in terms of disbursement or getting that money into the hands of businesses sooner rather than later.
And let's talk about people now, because social grants have increased somewhat. We're also getting people who are unemployed and are not benefiting from UIF, getting around 350 rand a month as a grant as well. There's still questions about how exactly that's going to work. But this move from government is basically trying to stop people from going to bed hungry. 350 rand, is that enough money for an entire month?
I definitely think that it's not enough, not nearly enough as what people sort of need. About a year ago, government or the ANC was considering an unemployment grant of around 1,600 for young people who are unemployed. I was expecting something along those orders. Obviously, government's in a difficult fiscal position currently and cannot sort of overextend itself. However, I do worry that the provided grant is insufficient or very small, negligible to make really any impact on someone's life. And at the same time, with the people now trying to qualify or apply for this grant, will actually compromise part of the lockdown in terms of people now having to move and deal with the Department of Department of Social Development. And I'm concerned as to whether administratively the department is ready to deal with the influx of people. And obviously, as the economic condition worsens, we expect more and more people who weren't recipients of the child or the old age grant to now apply for the COVID grant. And that's obviously going to put a lot of people on the streets. And I don't think that, obviously, as I mentioned, the 6-month period that this is limited to is going to be sufficient to have a significant impact on people's livelihoods or recovering the economy.
Very quickly, Siya, where this money is coming from is what is important, because, many people are looking at the IMF and we're wondering about the conditions when we get this money.
Sure. Look, I think the multinational institutions will always have conditionalities. I don't really see why or how people are asserting that it's going to be no strings attached. It's never been the case. The institutions need to make sure that the people or the borrowers, meaning the sovereign in South Africa in this case, has got the ability to pay back. And so everything from your state planning to your public debt management strategy moving forward is definitely going to come under scrutiny of international financing institutions, pushing us further back down the line of austerity budgets, etc., which is partly to blame for where we are now as a result of the socioeconomic challenges. But I think that there's still an opportunity. I mean, 2 weeks ago, the Reserve Bank provided liquidity to the tune of around 500 billion to local banks so that they could lend to businesses, etc. And I think that government could definitely access some of this money. But I don't want to look at it from an ideological perspective. I think if there are development finance institutions that are willing to give the funding at a very low interest rate such that it doesn't compromise public finances, government should definitely look at those development finance institutions such as the World Bank, etc. However, if the previous loan that they provided to Eskom is anything to go about, this is not actually a viable option that is sustainable for the fiscus moving forward, given that a lot of people are now calling for that loan to be expunged or for Eskom to be forgiven for that debt.
All right, thanks for the input. Appreciate it. Siya Biniza.